All right, I'm Nate the Lawyer, and this is a law channel, and we are about to break down the first week of the Diddy trial. And I'm going to straight up tell you, it looks like Diddy's going to jail for life. Let's break it down. All right, so with this video, I want to explain to you what the charges are in the Diddy trial, how the government is going about proving those charges, and whether they've been successful at demonstrating any of this criminal activity. Now, if you're watching this video, I assume you know who P. Diddy is, so I'm just going to get straight into what's going on. So when we're talking about P. Diddy's criminal trial, we're talking about 5 charges, but really 3 separate crimes. Okay, so the first count is racketeering conspiracy. To prove racketeering conspiracy by the government, you need to know the existence of the enterprise, Bad Boy Entertainment, or for instance, if it's the mafia, you got to prove the mob actually exists. Or if it's a street gang, you prove the street gang exists, the Bloods, for instance. You also need an agreement to participate by the defendant, and you need a pattern of racketeering activity. Now, with this last one, this pattern of racketeering activity, you may hear the term RICO predicates.
You could use it as probable cause for a warrant, couldn't you? Evidence of extortion, intent to defraud, those are RICO predicates, right?
Now, there are about 23 different crimes that the government's alleging that P. Diddy did, and here are some of those crimes like sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. And the government, again, just has to prove 2 of those things to get a conviction of the RICO statute. Then you also have sex trafficking by force, which we are going to go over in detail. And we also have transportation to engage in prostitution, which is known as the Mann Act, which essentially means you're paying for prostitutes to cross state lines. And we'll go into detail with that count too. So at the end of the day, these 3 individual charges and 5 counts overall are what the government is seeking to prove to put P. Diddy away for life. Now, to prove their case, the government has started with calling 5 witnesses this first week. The first is Israel Flores. He's a former assistant security director at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles, and now he is an LAPD officer. Now, the Intercontinental Hotel is where Diddy was caught on video beating Cassie, and he's the security guard that responded to Cassie's call for help. And he's also seen in that video. Next up is a man named Daniel Phillip. He's a former male escort and exotic performer. Now, being a male escort, Phillip testified that he participated in multiple freak-offs involving Cassie, and that he felt that Cassie at sometimes was not a willing participant in the freak-offs. Next, you had Diddy's longtime girlfriend, Cassie. She's a singer, model, and she was the one who participated in a lot of these freak-offs. She said too many to count. Now, she is seen on video getting beaten by Diddy, and she testified to the abuse, the sex trafficking, and the prostitution that was going on from state to state. You also have Dawn Richard, who was a former member of Danity Kane, the girl group created by Combs, and she also was in a group with Combs himself called Dirty Money, and she saw some of the abuse that occurred between Combs and Cassie. And last but not least, you have an agent from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. These are the people who conducted the raids on Diddy's houses, and they testified to the drugs and all the other debauchery they found in the house. All right, so now you know the witnesses. Let's get into the charges. First, let's start with the easiest one to prove, which is transportation to engage in prostitution. That's 18 U.S.C. section 2421, and they are counts 3 and 5. Now, this is known as the Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act has 2 elements the government has to prove. One, you transported someone between states, and you intended for that person who you transported across state lines to engage in prostitution. So let's start with the first element, interstate transportation, which is, I think, easy to prove. First, they had Cassie go up and describe how she was being flown to multiple states by Diddy to LA, NYC, Vegas, Miami, all for these freak-offs. And then you also had Daniel Phillip. Remember the sex worker? He described being brought to various cities by Combs and Cassie's request, and he was paid for sex on those trips. So it seems like the government has put up some proof that, yes, people were transported across state lines by Combs knowingly. Now, they had to prove the intent for prostitution. Well, how did they do that? Well, again, they brought Cassie Ventura off, and she testified that she was involved in these freak-offs, the sex parties. They were planned by Combs. There were multiple sex workers there, and she recounted specific events in New York and LA where these sex acts occurred. Also, they had Daniel Phillips testify about the sessions and the sex acts that he had in various cities, in various hotel suites paid for by Combs, which confirms the interstate travel for prostitution piece. Remember, he said he was paid to have sex with Cassie for these freak-offs. So when it comes to transportation to engage in prostitution under the law, it seems like the government has checked both those boxes. They have 2 witnesses and more that are going to testify about the freak-offs being flown out to multiple states to have commercial sex. Next, we're going to look at the sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion charges. How has the government in this first week put on evidence to show this? The elements for sex trafficking is the defendant knowingly caused a person to engage in a commercial sex act. The means of coercion was either force, threats of force, fraud, coercion, or anything that would get someone or force someone to engage in a commercial sex act. And then it had to be done across state lines. So let's start with the first element, knowingly engaging in sex trafficking. Have the government put on any evidence to show that Diddy knowingly caused a person to engage in commercial sex acts? Well, just before we get into that, let me define what a commercial sex act is. A commercial sex act is any sexual act in exchange for something of value: money, drugs, housing, career opportunities. So how did the government show this first week that Diddy knowingly caused someone to engage in commercial sex acts? Well, they put up Cassie Ventura, and she testified that Combs was the one who orchestrated the freak-offs, watched, recorded, gave instructions, paid the escorts. Even though Cassie didn't receive any payments, she said her career opportunities or her job was in jeopardy because she was expected to participate. She was flown to multiple different cities and complied out of fear. Also, we have Daniel Phillip, the male escort. He testified that he was paid about $4,000 in some instances to have sex with Cassie on multiple occasions in multiple different states. He claimed that Combs in the room directed them, sometimes recording. These sessions took place in hotels. He did everything from the payments, the setup, the location. He also confirmed the transactional nature of all this. And he said, quote, Diddy gave instructions. He directed us like a seed. He wanted to see something specific. So does this prove that Diddy knowingly caused people to engage in commercial sex acts? Well, the government thinks so. Now we're going to move to the next element, means of coercion. Now here the government has to prove that there was some force, threat of force, fraud, or coercion to essentially get the person to engage in commercial sex acts. And here prosecutors focused in on that force, threat of force, and coercion aspect of it. For instance, Daniel Phillips, he said that he witnessed Combs physically abuse Cassie. He noted Cassie was emotionally detached, visibly uncomfortable during the sex. Quote, he said she looked like she didn't want to be there. He also described the intense control that he had about the directions and watching and recording every time. And even on top of that, he said he feared Combs too. Now his testimony seems to corroborate the both physical and psychological coercion that Combs initiated to force Cassie to continue to do these particular sex acts. Then we also have Cassie Ventura's testimony about how she was physically abused, how he kicked her, punched her, dragged her, stomped on her head. She said that the freak-offs were not optional. I didn't want to be there, she said, but I didn't feel like I could say no. Combs even used what's known as emotional manipulation. He threatened her music career, which is coercion. He cut off her financial support, again, coercion. He forced her into isolation, again, another form of coercion. He supplied her with drugs to keep her compliant, blackmailed her, and recorded sex tapes. Quote, he told me if I left him, he'd release the tapes and destroy me. Now, also to show the physical force nature of it, the prosecutors also showed the video of Combs beating Cassie for trying to leave a freak-off. And they also had another witness who saw the beating. This was security guard Israel Flores, who's now an LAPD officer. He responded to the 2016 assault and said Cassie had a black eye, was crying, and was shaken, and she wanted to leave. Again, that shows the force part of forcing someone into sex trafficking. Combs tried to stop her from leaving, again, physically, so that's force again. Combs' demeanor was described as cold and dangerous. The security guard said he stared at me like the devil. This shows, again, physical violence and emotional control, coercion, threat of force, and force itself, all on video. And then the prosecutors called another eyewitness to the physical abuse that Cassie had to endure, and that's Dawn Richards. She was his band member, remember? And she said Combs attacked Cassie with a skillet, punched her, kicked her, and dragged her upstairs by force. It was witnessed by multiple people, including other bandmates. And then to intimidate the witnesses, the next day, Combs allegedly locked them into into a recording studio and told them the abuse was just passion and warned not to speak about it, implying that there would be consequences if they conveyed this to anyone else. So these three witnesses definitely spoke to the means of coercion. They talked about the force, the threats of force, and coercion, all supporting Cassie's claims. Now, for the last element, that's commercial sex act, I think it's clear that these people were paid to go from places like New York to Miami, or from Miami to California, to engage in these freak-offs, and that would be commercial sex acts across state lines. So now we've shown how the government is trying to prove transportation to engage in prostitution. We've also shown how the government is trying to prove sex traffic by force, fraud, or coercion. Now let's look at how the government's trying to prove the racketeering conspiracy. Now, for racketeering conspiracy, first you have to prove the existence of the enterprise or the mob or the gang. And here they're saying the existence of the organization is Combs Enterprises, Bad Boy Entertainment. These are the companies and organizations that Combs used to facilitate his freak-offs and his sex trafficking. Next, you're going to be looking for whether there was an agreement to participate. The defendant had to know this negative stuff was going on. He had to know the freak-offs were going on, know the prostitutes were being paid and flown across the country. Have the government, or can the government prove this agreement, or that the defendant knowingly agreed to participate in these criminal activities? Now, the last element for the racketeering conspiracy is you have to show a pattern of racketeering activity, meaning that there's at least two acts of what they call RICO predicates. They're also known as racketeering activity, and they had to have occurred within the last 10 years. Now listen, that's just a convoluted way of saying there's a list of crimes, and if we can prove that you committed 2 of these crimes, then you can go to jail for life under RICO. Now, I need people to understand, since this is a RICO conspiracy, Combs doesn't even have to know if any of those other crimes are actually being committed to be held accountable under the RICO conspiracy statute. So now let's look at the list of crimes that the government is alleging that P. Diddy Combs has committed that falls into this pattern of racketeering activity. Now, I put them in a nice chart, and this is from the indictment. You got kidnapping, arson, bribery, witness tampering, forced labor, sex trafficking, prostitution, transportation, drug distribution. Now, from this list, the government only has to prove 2 of these things happened within the past 10 years from this enterprise. Now, from this list of charges, the government, I think, has for sure proven transportation for prostitution. They have the prostitutes up there saying, yeah, we were traveled from New York to Miami to engage in these freak-offs and get paid for it, right? So 13G seems to be well on its way to being proven. And then we also have the sex trafficking allegations. We not only have Cassie's sex trafficking allegations, we have some other women. Now, what about 13H? Drug distribution. There were drugs at these parties. Both the escort and Cassie testified to it. The raids on Diddy's homes. The Homeland Security person also testified that they found illegal drugs in Diddy's properties, along with the 1,000 bottles of baby oil. What about bribery of a witness? The hotel security guard said that Diddy tried to hand him a wad of cash and told him to keep quiet. Well, is this bribery? And if it is, that's a RICO predicate. Now remember, the government doesn't have to prove them all. They just have to show 2 of them. And I think they are well on their way to showing more than 2 of these RICO predicates in the Combs case. Now, it's important to note, this was just week 1 of the trial. These were just the first couple of witnesses. So we have a lot more to go. And then we also have the defense putting up their witnesses to show that this didn't happen or this may be a mistake. But listen, if there's anyone out there saying that the government hasn't proven anything, hasn't shown anything, it's essentially just a disaster, they don't know what they're talking about. Because if you just take the elements and the witness testimony and see what the government's trying to do, it's clear the government is on its way to what looks like a conviction that can put this man in jail for life. And even if you don't believe Cassie, for instance, they have another witness who's saying something similar happened to her. If you don't believe the one escort, guess what? They have a whole bunch of other escorts coming to testify about their experiences. So this is just not a one witness case. The government has given themselves a whole bunch of avenues to gain a conviction in this case. And again, like I'm going to say it, I think transportation to engage in prostitution, I think they've essentially proven that. And the more people they get on to show that they transported them from different places across the country to engage in freak-offs, they have that in spades. The counts of sex trafficking by force, you may want to quibble about it, but I think they are either close to convincing a jury that they got that, or they've already done so. And the racketeering conspiracy charges. If you agree with count 2, that transportation to engage in prostitution, and count 3, the sex trafficking by force has been proven, then it essentially gives you the racketeering conspiracy as a bonus. Now, if you guys don't agree with what I'm saying, let me know in the comment section. Say, hey, Nate, this is all wrong. I believe that the prosecution has proven nothing. Because if you do, then I'll just say it. I don't think you're looking at this trial. You may be watching a trial, but you're not watching this one, because it's very clear that the government is methodically laying out the elements for all of these charges. And right now, I think Diddy has a real possibility of facing life in prison without the possibility, because that's what he's facing in these charges. This is not a joke, and we have a lot more that the prosecution is still putting on. This is week 1, people, and I think it's already bad. Well, with that being said, don't forget, like, share, subscribe, do all that great YouTube stuff if you like this breakdown. My name is Nate the Lawyer, and I'll see you in the next breakdown. Peace.